Dr. Joe Perez is a senior systems analyst and team lead at the North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services. And a little bit about him, having received both a bachelor's and master's degree in secondary education, Joe began a 10-year career as a high school teacher providing instruction in economics, Spanish, Bible, and computers. While in his teaching career, he furthered his graduate education, earning a doctorate in education with a double minor in computers and computers and theology. I thought that said technology. His career focus changed to IT in 1992 when he started as a computer consultant at North Carolina State University. So it sounds like he's been in North Carolina State for 25 years, business intelligence specialist, senior business analyst, and what else? I'm sure he can tell you more about himself, but he's been promoted to senior systems analyst and team lead. His talk is called Making Data Actionable from Concept to Visualization. I'm excited to hear it, but I'm going to turn off my camera and turn off my microphone and say, Joe, you've got a half hour, go for it. And thanks for joining us.
Wonderful, Debbie. Thank you so much, ma'am. It's a pleasure to be with y'all today. Thank you so much for joining me with this talk on making data actionable. And I'm sharing my screen, making sure everybody can see what we're talking about here. You should see my title slide that has my contact information on it. No, that is not intended to be a shameless plug. It's simply so that you know who I am and what I'm all about. I appreciate your introduction, Debbie. And again, I appreciate the opportunity to speak about a topic that I am extremely passionate about. So let's get started. Since I have 30 minutes, I want to be conscious of everyone's time and ensure that I am judicious with the use of that time. So we'll just jump right in. Let's start off with a challenge. On May 25th, 1961, President John F. Kennedy, in an address to the U.S. Congress, issued a challenge to the entire country when he said, "I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth." Last July marked the 50th anniversary of the day America met that challenge. That was just 8 years after the president threw down the gauntlet. But you know what? This monumental feat could not have been accomplished without having data that was made actionable. I mean, there were innumerable logistical issues for them to tackle. I'll give you a few of them on the screen here. Things like timing the launch when the relative positions of Earth and Moon were optimal, choosing a landing site that met all the right conditions, supplying the needs of the astronauts, calculating fuel consumption parameters, most importantly, getting them there and returning them home safely. Obviously, you don't want to get stuck on the moon and not get back, right? I mean, you know, the list just goes on and on and on. Remember, the microprocessor would not even be invented until 1971. So the technology needed to conquer all these insurmountable obstacles simply did not exist. I mean, it's not like they could Google anything because the internet hadn't been invented yet either. You know, they just had to make it up as they went. All of this exponentially increased the value of actionable data for the Apollo program, for NASA to have the insight that they needed to answer all those incessant questions, make those tough decisions, and ultimately meet JFK's challenge. Well, actually, they exceeded it, didn't they? Techopedia defines actionable insight as information that can be acted upon or information that gives enough insight into the future so that actions that should be taken become clear for the folks that are making decisions. In other words, meaningful data that's going to be useful for making a decision, answering a question, and solving a problem. Now, remember those three characteristics of actionable data because you'll see them crop up from time to time throughout this presentation. But with every data visualization, you have to start somewhere, right? You have a concept or an idea in mind, and then you have as your end goal a completed visualization containing one or more graphs. Now, here's the $64,000 question. How do you get from concept to reality, right? I like to think of this data visualization journey, if you will, in the UX space as a spectrum, right? Along which I suggest various stages, specifically 5 in this case, for best practices in getting from the concept on the left to the completed visualization on the right. These 5 stages are conception, inception, perception, inspection, and direction. And now, the way you see them laid out on the screen from left to right here might make you assume that my intent is for them to occur one after the other. Yeah, maybe so, but they can also have some concurrence to them, even overlapping. But, in any case, we need to view these in the light of a strategy that's comprehensive and with a positive mindset. You see, this is supposed to be an enjoyable thing to do, folks, not a drudgery. And also keep in mind that before your concept can become reality, it needs to be visualized and it must stand up to scrutiny. I'll give you more detail on that in just a little bit. All right, so the first stage is conception. You have to start the race somewhere, right? I see the key word here as articulate. In articulating the need, it's important to remember your audience. Tricia Underwood made reference to this. She's Senior Visualization Director. Recently, she said, your audience determines the depth of your data communication and the presentation method. Well, that makes perfect sense to me. You've got to know the audience, okay? That's a given. But you also need to articulate what you're going to do with that data, and doing so is where your concept or idea is conceived. Now, the most important thing to be articulated is the purpose for your data, right? What is it that you're trying to show? Look at these 4 categories on the screen. Are you showing comparison, distribution, composition, or relationship? Well, the answer to that is going to determine the type of visualization that's most appropriate for the given situation. And that, in turn, is going to lead to more questions that will help you to refine your approach along the way. Think of it as a hierarchy. Dr. Andrew Abella, chairman of the Department of Business and Economics at the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C., has come up with an amazing graphics tool that I believe masterfully articulates the need and sets the pace with these 4 categories that he suggested. So if you're showing comparison, you should ask, am I comparing among items or over time, with the key being behavior? If you're showing distribution, the question becomes, well, among how many variables is this being distributed, with the key of dimension? If you're showing composition, the question becomes, does it change over time or is it static over time? Structures, the key word here. And fourthly, if you're showing relationship, you should ask, well, how many variables are being related, with the key being class? And by class, I mean, what type of relationship do these variables have to each other, right? Is it linear, inverse, or direct squared? Now, here's a closer look at Abella's chart. Choose or cheat sheet. Bit of a tongue twister, right? All right, you see how the 4 categories radiate out from the center, and then all the questions and sub-questions radiating out from that with the appropriate chart types on the very end. So let's take composition for an example. Yes, does it change over time or is it static over time? And if it changes over time, yes, well, do you have many periods or a few periods? And if you have many periods, well, then you ask, are the differences relative or are they relative and absolute? You see how questions lead to more questions as you proceed down the decision tree, refining your approach, and finally being able to come up with the graph that's the most appropriate, at least what's considered to be the best practice. That's the stage of conception. Second stage, inception. Once you've started the race, you need to make the case. Keyword, articulate. Make the case for expressing the concept visually. Hey, folks, this is really powerful for a couple of reasons. Mike Parkinson, the founder and CEO of Billion Dollar Graphics, says that we're affected by graphics in 2 ways. cognitively, and emotionally. First of all, cognitively. Okay, graphics are going to speed up the way we communicate. They help us to better understand and more clearly remember what we've learned. And they're like visual cues that we can use to unlock a deeper meaning and focus our attention so it's more likely we'll remember what we've seen. Secondly, we're also affected emotionally. Graphics also improve our mindset and affect our feelings. They connect with our creativity by stimulating different parts of the brain, leading us to more fully understand what's being presented. If you've ever seen a graph that catches your eye and focuses your attention, it's something you're really passionate about, you have made an emotional connection with your data, that's something that no spreadsheet or tabular report could possibly do. Hey, folks, do you realize what Parkinson is saying here? We're affected cognitively and emotionally. In other words, graphics get a hold of both our brains and our hearts. What better marriage could you possibly want? I mean, anytime you can touch both the brain and the heart, oh man, you've got something good going. British data journalist David McCandless said in a 2010 TED Talk that sight, by far, has the highest bandwidth of any of the five senses. About 80% of the information we take in is by eye, he said. A couple of European research professors, Emery Sawyer and Robin Hogarth, teamed up on a study in which three groups of economists were asked us just one single question about this particular data set. Now, the results of their study seem to support McCandless's TED Talk claim. Okay, one group was given the data and a standard statistical analysis of the data. Remember, all they had to do was just answer one question. But 72% of the economists in that first group got the answer wrong. A second group was given the data, the statistical analysis, and a graph. Now, you suppose that this group did better than the first one, right? Well, they did, but not by much. Still, 61% of the second group got the answer wrong. A third group was given only the graph, okay? No analysis, no data, no nothing, just the graph. And only 3% of them got the answer wrong. You know what? This certainly makes the case for visual representation of data. And I believe that it's something that we should advocate. All right, that's the stage of inception. Third stage, perception. Once you've started the race and you've made your case, it's time to motivate the base. Keyword here is educate. Folks, we're not going to get very far in this process if either the target audience or your stakeholders are not on board. You know what? We need to educate them, right? Making them realize that they've got some skin in this game. See, they cannot take ownership or provide the necessary backing, financially or otherwise, if they don't understand what you're trying to present, or if they can't see what's in it for them, or if the visualization does not help them to make a decision, answer a question, or solve a problem. I told you you'd see those again. Okay, so how do we go about doing this? Well, in any educational endeavor, it's foundational to adhere to, follow, and learn certain basic principles. All right, for instance, you ever hear anybody say, he's all talk and no action, or she's all fluff and no substance, or this project is nothing but form without function? You know, that begs the question, does form follow function? You know, I have to say yes, and inevitably leads to another question. Well, what do you mean by form and function? Okay, function is what you're going to do with the data, whereas form is how to express functional outcomes in the best possible way. Now, here's some best practices or cardinal rules that we need to keep in mind that will definitely ensure that function is given the right priority over form, okay? Let me show you some pitfalls and how to avoid them. All right, first of all, pie charts. Oh boy, you gotta love them or hate them, right? There's typically no middle ground with these guys. I mean, some people think they're the best thing since sliced bread, while others say they're the spawn of the devil himself. Look, regardless of how you might feel about pie charts. Let's say your mom baked you a small pie when you were a kid and said you could have the whole thing. Maybe not all of it at one time, so she cuts it into 4 slices. Now, if we were in a live audience, I would ask you, how many slices would you end up eating if you were to consume the whole pie? I hope you'd say 4. And that's correct. It should be pretty easy to understand this particular concept that I'm showing you here. Pie charts are supposed to show the parts of a whole. Everybody ought to know that, you'd think. But not everybody gets it. I'll show you what I mean. Take a look at the pie chart shown in this fuzzy screenshot from a TV newscast. I see a couple of problems with this thing right off the bat. All right, first of all, look at the slices. Look at the numbers, rather. They add up to 193. Good grief, how can you have 193% of a single pie? Okay, that's almost like 2 pies, right? Secondly, look at the sizes of each slice. Now, 70 is bigger than 60, isn't it, right? Well, then how come the 60 slice is bigger than the 70 slice? I mean, in reality, what's going on with this pie chart here, other than mayhem, madness, and weirdness, and incorrectness, or whatever? All right, look, the questions that were used in putting together this news report, the survey behind it, I should say, allowed for multiple choices. That is, the respondents were allowed to indicate support for more than one candidate. Haha, now you get it, right? Now you see why the numbers add up to more than 100. Okay, that in and of itself is not necessarily a problem. The problem is, folks, this is not how you do things in a pie chart. And therefore, I would very quickly conclude that this pie chart is misleading. And in this particular case, perhaps a bar graph would show the data more accurately, don't you think? Maybe something like this. The same data, right? But depicted in a way that is not misleading. So what about line graphs and bar charts? Well, the y-axis should have a consistent scale. Take a look at this chart showing how people age 25 and older, what percent they make up of total college enrollment, and how that trend has changed over time. Now, upon first glance, you might assume that there's this huge spike between 1973 and 1974. But if you look more closely, you'll see the odd way in which the y-axis is scaled. See that? From 28 to 33%, thus making the change between those 2 years appear to be fairly drastic. The line's going almost straight up. By contrast, look at the chart on the right. Okay, this one is misleading. But the one on the right, I don't think it's misleading. You see, it's the same data, but do you see the difference? And I'm not talking about the fact that it's a bar graph. No, I mean, the same thing would hold true with a line chart. Here's the difference. The y-axis is scaled to start from 0. And you can see perhaps a more accurate depiction of that enrollment trend over that same 5-year period of time. Therefore, I would call this chart not misleading. You see, many organizations, you say, why is this happening? Many organizations are going to purposefully represent their graphics in a particular way without any regard for statistical accuracy. All they have in mind is just making it look good, right? In other cases, specific misrepresentation happens for self-serving purposes. I want the data to say what I want it to say. Rather than letting the data speak for itself, they try to manipulate it and make it look good, quote unquote. You know what? I'd much rather hold myself to a higher standard of accuracy and integrity. But that said, it doesn't necessarily mean that you must always force the y-axis to be started to scale from 0 in every single case, every single time. I mean, sometimes when you're looking at multiple data sets with multiple observations and there's a whole bunch of numbers and are really, really close together, the only way you can tell them apart and see the difference between them, graphically depicted, is to zoom in on that scale. All I'm suggesting, whatever you do, be consistent across the board here and avoid making changes over time appear to be more drastic than they really are. So not only should the y-axis be scaled consistently, but it should also be labeled properly. And check out this chart. Now, I'm one for trying to adopt a minimalist approach and not over-label things, but I see something missing here. See, there's no y-axis. Well, I mean, it's there, but it's not labeled. And sometimes if your graph doesn't have a label on the vertical axis, it can be misleading, especially in this case. Look at that last bar on the right, the yellow one or orange, whatever color that is. Doesn't that thing look like it's maybe 4 or 5 times bigger than that first one on the left? Yeah. However, the last time I checked, 2062 is not 4 or 5 times bigger than 1371. So although the minimalist approach can be a good thing to do, in this particular case, I would call this chart misleading. Now, there's some other best practices that influence perception. I'll show them to you here on the screen. For sake of time, I won't go into a lot of detail. But if you're plotting something chronologically, go from left to right, right? Past on the left, present in the middle, future to the right using the x-axis. If you're showing quantity, plot it along the y-axis. Smaller numbers at the bottom, bigger numbers at the top. You say, why do you tell me this? There's a marked trend a little bit at a time that I've seen in some places where there's a tendency to reverse this practice. I'll admit it looks pretty cool, but it's still confusing. And then be consistent with your use of colors, remembering certain universal constants. For instance, everybody knows that red means stop, green means go, right? Obviously these days we may be encouraged to adopt a more muted palette and take cultural differences with what the red means, take color blindness into consideration. But regardless, agreed, okay? But the principle still holds. Like contrasting colors differentiate between groups, whereas different shades of the same color can communicate the relative strength or weakness of a value. And then keep your shaped graphical elements proportional to each other. Master statistician and Yale professor Edward Tufte used to advocate not exceeding what he called the lie factor. Essentially, it says that the representation of numbers as physically measured on the surface of a graph, your shaped graphs and elements in your visualization should be directly proportional to the quantities they represent. As a mathematical equation, it's often expressed like this. The size of the effect shown in the graphic divided by the size of the effect shown in the data should never be greater than 1. Here's a real-world example. In one of their iterative product releases for a new iPad model several years ago, Apple touted the greater battery capacity of the new model over its predecessor. And rightfully so. I mean, a 17% increase in battery power is nothing to sneeze at. But look at this graph, though. The battery icon on the right, representing the capacity of the new model, that thing looks like it's maybe 3 or 4 times bigger than the one on the left, representing the predecessor. That's certainly way more than 17%. And as much as I like my iPad, that, my friend, is a misleading graph. And finally, use the right tool for the right job. You wouldn't use a chainsaw to carve a turkey, would you? How about a sledgehammer to crack a walnut? All right, okay, those are silly examples, but the same thing holds true with visualizations. Right tool, right job. For instance, pie charts. They're great when they're used for the purpose that they're intended to be used for. Yeah, unless you're one of those that say they're the spawn of the devil. Okay, but 2 pie charts side by side, not so much. No. In all fairness, these 2 pie charts are 100% accurate. Okay, there's nothing deceptive going on here. But you have to go back to that make the case, the inception stage, and ask, what is it that you're trying to show? Can you make a decision, answer a question, or solve a problem with it? Now, each pie chart by itself is trying to show how these 5 countries compare among themselves, and to what extent they contribute to the whole. The two pie charts together show how that overall makeup changed from one point in time on the left to the next one on the right. Now, yeah, for the sake of the argument, it doesn't make any difference what time frame is being compared in the pie, or what the parts of the whole represent. No, here's the problem. See, the human eye, together with the human brain, simply doesn't have the spatial acuity to perceive minute variances in multiple dimensions at the same time, okay? In simpler terms, for those who would use a chainsaw to carve a turkey, it's hard for us to see them slices when the pies are side by side like that. Precisely. So while these pie charts are accurate, they are not actionable, because we're not able to do any of the three things I talked about. Remember the three characteristics of actionable data? They need to help you to make a decision, answer a question, or solve a problem. And why is that? Because you can't tell just by looking at the pies. Did you hear what I just said? Isn't that the whole point of a visualization, right? The visual part of that? Good grief, you have to be able to tell just by looking at it. If you can't, it's not actionable. If somebody has to explain it to you, it's not actionable. If you can't tell what's going on, it's just plain flat out not actionable. Now, what if we were to express the data in these two pie charts as side-by-side bar graphs? Watch what happens. See? Instantly, just like that, you can tell that what it is that they were trying to depict in the two charts. That is, the order of the countries, their ranking from 1 to 5, was totally reversed in the second time period. Let's see how easy that is. Some might say that's as easy as pie. Sorry about that. Bad pun. I know nobody can laugh or groan at my jokes. That's the beauty of an online conference. All right, earlier we asked the question, does form follow function? We answered it with a yes. I think at this point, another question to ask is, does conclusion follow assumption? You know what? I don't think so. Not always, anyway. And it's because people don't always see things the same way. What do you mean by that? Well, let's take a closer look. See this picture? Now, if we were in a live audience, I'd ask you to shout out to me, what do you see? Some people say they see an old lady. Some people say they see a young lady. I see the young lady. She's facing away from the camera. You can study that yourself and look at it later and pause the recording. I won't take the time to go into an explanation now. The old lady, if you look closely, she is facing toward the camera. You see her pointy chin jutting off to the left, and her mouth, big old nose with a wart on it. So some think young lady, some think old lady. Who's right? I'd say both, right? It all depends on your perception. Let me ask you this. How would you describe an elephant to somebody who's never seen one? Can you imagine walking into a room and trying to feel your way through, what is it that you're touching here? You're going to come out there saying, it's a sphere, it's a fan, it's a wall, it's a rope, it's a tree, it's a snake, right? Different people perceive things in different ways. And in making data actionable, we must capitalize on that. All right, so what have you done so far? You've started the race, you've made your case, and you motivated the base. Now, give it some space by asking the question, does it stand up to scrutiny? This is inspection. Keyword, investigate. Hey, folks, being totally transparent, I believe, is the only way that you're going to avoid the pitfalls of bias and unethical use of your data. And when we've done our due diligence, we're not going to cringe when we get these questions. You know, questions I'm talking about, like, did you ensure data quality? Where did you get your data? How do you know it's right? Okay, you're not going to be intimidated by these questions. They won't bother you. Now, here's a trend that sounds counterintuitive. The more complex your data model is, the less likely your people will be to embrace it. To that point, suppose you wanted to buy a blender for your grandmother, and the only choices you had are the ones shown on this slide. Which one do you think would be the better choice? Enough said. All right. As you let the data behind your visualization stand up to inspection, it's important to be aware of the difference between impact and influence and how that plays into making data actionable. Hold on a second. I thought impact and influence were the same thing. No, I don't think so. I see a difference between them. See, impact is typically recognized as being an effect brought on by external forces that tend to push on your status quo. In a recent Harvard Business Review study, it was found that almost 85% of a company's performance depends upon outside factors. However, the funny thing about it, many of those same companies don't even have a clue about figuring out which of those outside forces are affecting their performance and how. Instead, those who make it a priority to identify these factors are pushed into acting upon them. That's impact. By contrast, influence is generally known to be the power to affect from internal factors that tend to pull on your status quo. See the difference? Impact is external, tends to push. Influence is internal, tends to pull. These are factors that your own organization can control. I'm talking about things like the way your data is organized and structured, when and how you're going to pull it into your data warehouse, and the general climate in your organizational culture. See, doing this is going to pull your strategy in the right direction from the inside. To put it bluntly, as I alluded to at or near the beginning of this presentation, an idea must be visualized, then scrutinized before it can be realized. Okay, in other words, if you've given it some space and it can stand up to inspection, you, my friend, are well on your way to making your concept a reality with actionable data. Now, that said, I believe that we can measure success by capitalizing on this knowledge and turning ideas into reality by blending impact with influence, leveraging them into a solid game plan to meet short-term needs and provide long-term benefits. And why is that? Well, because look at this chart here as it builds on the screen. By this point, you will have learned to take your data, differentiate it to come up with information, see the connections to derive knowledge, determine the meaningful connections to grant insight, find the best paths between them for wisdom, and boom. At that point, you have impact, and you will most certainly generate influence. All right, so after having started the race, making the case, motivating the base, and giving it some space, we now come to the fifth and final stage of the spectrum, direction. It's time to put it into place. Keyword here, effectuate. Hey, folks, in the UX space, you are the catalyst, right? You're the one who's gone through the stages. You're the one who has asked the right questions, done your due diligence, scrubbed your data, chosen the right visualizations, ensured validity and integrity. So what's your implementation plan, right? How do you put it into place? What's your direction here? I see this implementation cycle as a fourfold iterative process. Okay, you start off by deploying your solution using whatever organizational protocols and methodologies you've already got in place. All right, as your stakeholders start using the solution, they'll discover issues. And let me tell you, they will discover issues. I mean, they may call them issues, they may call them problems, they may call them defects, but mark my words, they are definitely going to discover issues. All right, then you analyze those issues and discern the right course of action to address them. Then you start developing the remediation for those issues, and guess what? The cycle starts all over again. Deploy, discover, discern, and develop. You know, hopefully you're going to improve upon your solution with each iterative cycle. Hey, that is an effective direction because it leads to progress. So, in conclusion, you ask, can I really turn my ideas into reality? You bet your boots you can. I mean, while developing your solution and moving it along these stages of the spectrum, try to ensure best practices are followed. American mathematician John Tukey once said, the greatest value of a picture is when it forces us to notice what we never expected to see. Hey, friends, what value do you see in your data? And what ideas do you have when you see it? Remember, graphs and data visualizations, here's how you stimulate these ideas. Remembering that they're only as good as the data they portray. They should be no more complex than the data they portray, and they should never paint a distorted picture of the values that they portray. And don't forget Tufte's lie factor, right? And never let the size of the effect shown in the graphic be greater than the size of the effect shown in the data. All right, one last review. Here are the 5 stages of the spectrum one last time. You see them on your screen. And you know, as you look at these 5 stages, I am totally convinced that if you articulate, advocate, educate, and investigate your data, you should be able to effectuate a solution. Enterprise account executive and expert data storyteller Spencer Sobczak once said, data storytelling is both an art and a science. You know what? Our data visualizations are the most powerful when they find this balance. Ladies and gentlemen, with actionable data, NASA exceeded President Kennedy's monumental challenge more than 50 years ago, and not only sent astronauts to the moon successfully, but they also returned them to Earth safely. And what's more, they repeated it 5 more times over the next 3 years. Remember, data is actionable only when it helps you to make a decision, answer a question, or solve a problem. Hey, what can you do with actionable data? You may not be putting a man on the moon, but you can certainly put the heat on your competition. Okay, if you have the vision and the drive, you can figure out how to get from today to tomorrow before it becomes yesterday and you get left behind. So I leave you with some parting advice for my good friend Bob. There once was a man named Bob whose boss was a bit of a slob. He made a nice graph, but didn't do the math, so he ended up out of a job. Okay, what's the advice here? Don't be like Bob. Turn your ideas into reality by making data actionable. Thank you so much for your time.
Hey, thanks, Dr. Joe. I'm definitely a UX catalyst, and thanks for reminding everybody to care about color blindness in their data visualizations.